To discuss the finer points of why I love this film so much, I basically have to ruin the mystery. Consider this your spoiler warning. I talk a good deal about villainous characters on this channel and how often they illustrate the thin line between the darkness they inhibit and the heroes they oppose, and no piece of media blurs that line and toes it beautifully, quite like one of my favorite films, 2018's A Simple Favor. A Simple Favor starts off as a simple story of a simple dynamic between Stephanie Smothers, played by Anna Kendrick, and Blake Lively's role of Emily Nelson, two women who couldn't be more different and strike an unlikely friendship. Stephanie is a single mom who volunteers for every classroom duty she can, showers her son in affection, and runs a homemaker vlog, while Emily's an executive who leaves her son in the care of her husband at any opportunity, drinks in the middle of the day, and can't bear to involve herself in pinkish mommy proclivities. The two decide to start spending time together when their sons start playing together, and from there a fascinating story unfolds. Stephanie and Emily hit it off pretty well despite their stark differences and gradually grow to love keeping each other company, drinking, discussing their love lives and their careers, growing to understand and influence each other. Emily takes Stephanie under her wing and teaches her to be a more assertive woman, from the joy of a cocktail at the end of the day to standing up to domineering men, prioritizing herself when the job of being a mother can sometimes smear one's identity. And it's in the midst of this budding friendship that Emily disappears. With Emily suddenly and without explanation missing, Stephanie, having grown so close to Emily and her family, finds herself dispositioned as a pillar of emotional support for Emily's husband and son. She stays in their home with them while investigating Emily's disappearance, and all the while she finds herself settling in nicely to the space Emily once occupied. Stephanie utilizes the skills she learned from Emily to make progress in finding her, while also emulating her friend at home. She begins to try on Emily's expansive wardrobe, growing suited to Emily's lavish home and her husband. News breaks that Emily's dead body has been found, and Stephanie, feeling the need to help her family, finds herself even more attached, to no objection from Emily's husband. This causes resistance from Emily's son, perhaps a reasonable reaction to a woman he perceives as trying to take the place of his mom, whom he insists he's seen lurking around his school playground and is still alive. Chillingly, this is no mistake, as Emily only faked her death in the name of an insurance ploy, and she takes great exception to her best friend taking over her life. Something of a delicious irony considering she created this monster in the form of the newly empowered Stephanie, and this is the groundwork for the conflict within A Simple Favor, hoisted perfectly by our two main characters and how their sense of identity overlaps and blends like a crude paint mixture. Despite her initial reluctance to befriend Stephanie, Emily absolutely saw a project in the button-down house mom. Stephanie dotes on her son to the point of overcompensation and bristles at any notion of counterculture, armors that Emily gradually breaks down. No small step of which involves peeling back the layers of how Stephanie developed these scruples, stemming from her greatest shame, the day she was reunited with her estranged brother. Stephanie found herself helplessly enamored with her brother's resemblance to her absentee father, and she gave in to the temptation to sleep with him, angering her husband who invited her brother to a car ride, which ended in a murder-suicide that took both of their lives. It's after learning this however bewildering backstory that Stephanie's sensitivities make a lot more sense, as her one major act of straying from the norm resulted in severe punishment in the form of an intense trauma. This is why she goes out of her way to be the best mom she can be, and do as much as she can within her own son's classroom to create a picturesque life for her son after suffering so much directly to the temptation to do otherwise. This is what makes Emily and Stephanie's dynamic so earnest and also so engaging. Friendships are often begotten by one person filling in the blind spots of another, so to speak. One person opening the eyes of another to a world of possibilities and perspectives. Considering Stephanie never had enough compassion for herself to pursue much of a social life, the reverence she reserves for Emily is palpable. a rare friend and one teaching her things she desperately needed to hear. Stephanie holds counsel and advice as something of a love language, demonstrated by her main hobby being vlogging. She can publicly show her parental tips and tricks while keeping her audience and potential company a parasocial arm's length away. She's invested in setting an example for other parents, but she's trepidatious to be close to anyone else aside from that, which speaks to how quickly Stephanie and Emily become inseparable. And this is mutual, considering Emily is similarly lonely, drowning in work and seeing her husband as more of a fixture of her family than someone she truly confides in or even really respects. As if able to sense this vulnerability, Emily latches to Stephanie and begins to sculpt her in a distinct image. And we gradually learn all Emily ever wanted was someone just like herself in her own life. As Stephanie uncovers the details of Emily's sordid past, we learn her birth name was Hope, and she grew up with a twin sister called Faith. Hope and Faith grew up in an abusive household, sent to corrective camps which they'd vandalize and escape. Hope and Faith split up for their own safety, and since then all Hope wanted was someone to be on her side, and resemble her no matter how far she drifts from the norm. Emily's a neglectful mother, a belittling lover, and an overall destructive personality, and she's well aware of that. There's a defeatist quality to Emily in that she seems keenly aware that she's kind of a monster, but she's also steadfast that she loves her son Nicky. This is the important crux of the character, that Emily won't hesitate to admit, if not flaunt, her flaws, but equally so doesn't let that invalidate her own values. Between her own twin sister and the sort of pupil she made of Stephanie, I feel she wanted to breed facsimiles of herself to see someone with her own eyes act like herself and still feel capable of worthy of love. All the better these changes come at the expense of the qualities that make Stephanie her antithesis. It's in this way that Stephanie and Emily aren't just opposites in their flaws, but in how they deal with them. Stephanie overcompensates by going out of her way to be the essential mommy, and Emily just kinda lets it all hang out. And you can see these mentalities through their respective sons, too. Emily's son, Nicky, often plays rough and comes off as hostile at times, eager to explore things like killing in games, with the much gentler Miles, who was brought up by Stephanie to compromise and play gently. The boys remain innocent despite it all and grow closer while living together in the stead of Emily, who is out putting the crux of her identity crisis into action. As Hope grew into her new identity of Emily, she found it harder to relate to an increasingly distant husband, and she made her infamous disappearance to seek out her estranged twin, Faith, and Faith resembles the twin sister she once knew in no way. The classy and prim Emily no longer able to see her reflection in her disheveled sister, Emily kills Faith, setting her insurance scheme into motion when she passes her twin's corpse off as her own. It's this conflicted nature of Emily that makes her so interesting. She's constantly seeking duplicates of herself, whether her own twin or a companion she personally influences, and then subsequently grows uncomfortable with what she sees in them and seeks to get rid of them, as she did to Faith and later does as she resents Stephanie's posturing, conveying a self-pride and self-loathing that spreads overall chaos in every direction she impacts. When the doppelganger she develops in her mind strays from her ideal, or perhaps digs their heels too far into aspects of herself that make her uncomfortable, her modus operandi fixates on destroying them. Though Stephanie would appear to be Emily's final attempt at such a conquest, as picking apart someone so different from herself would only beget the perfect balance between their disparate personalities. Stephanie learned from Emily the practice of carrying herself with confidence and assertion while never losing the sense of fairness or compassion that made her a good mom in the first place. We see Stephanie shift before our very eyes, and it's incredibly empowering to see the anxious doormat we saw at the start of the movie take just enough influence from Emily to stand up for herself, but not to the point where she becomes an outright manipulative reprobate. I feel this is best illustrated by the fact that using all of Emily's advice and way of manipulation and strong-arming to lure Emily out of hiding and back where she wants her, Stephanie's true trump card is her mommy vlog, which she uses to expose Emily on a live feed confessing to her own crimes. What really speaks to me about A Simple Favor is how beautifully it plays with the theme of ambivalence. While Emily and Stephanie grow to be adversaries out of what's been necessitated by their own ideals, I never really got the impression that they grew to hate each other. Conveyed like a teacher and student dynamic gone sour, they still owe a lot to one another. Their families remain relatively entangled, and they're always a part of one another, just as Emily's lessons became weapons that would behoove Stephanie in her endeavor to track Emily down. Paired with this mentality is one of temperance, with which Stephanie asserted herself without completely going over the deep end like Emily, which just as much so is an important message. Maybe in some ways, Stephanie became what Emily always wanted to be, someone who wasn't afraid to seek out what they wanted and stray from the norm, but could still leave a functional, happy life as a put together and decent human being. It's what makes A Simple Favor one of my favorite movies to unwind to. It both exercises and excises those nasty tendencies to such great effect, and after a long, rough day, it pairs well with a cocktail.